turn to our final proposition of the day. And the final proposition is, of course, about the topic we have perhaps hinted at, but really not focused and drilled down on, and that is Chinese politics. So this is a bit of a mouthful. We went around and round about how to really define this, this proposition. To summarize it, it basically means to make China a truly modern country, that China has to change its political system. The wording we've used is China must undertake radical political reforms in order to successfully transition into a modern economy with a stable society and a benevolent political system. So, of course, we all know that China still has a tightly controlled one-party system, and that stands in sharp contrast to what most modern economies have. Most modern economies have pluralistic political systems. And so this raises the question whether China's political model is the right model to serve China's interest, to bring China into the modern world, or whether it in some way needs to be adjusted. Can China be a successful economy and a successful society with the political system that it has today? So I'm very pleased to have two terrific presenters for this proposition. And please, while I'm introducing them, go ahead and vote whether you agree or you disagree with the proposition. And to my right is Professor David Shambaugh, who has made a very cogent argument in his recent book, China's Future, in agreeing that with the proposition that China must undertake radical political reforms. Professor Shambaugh is a professor of political science and international affairs and founding director of the China Policy Program at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. And then arguing against the proposition is Dr. Daniel Bell, a professor, chair professor of the Schwarzman Scholar Program at Tsinghua University in Beijing. So I think as we've sort of tap danced around these political questions all day, now we really get to focus on this particular issue. So we're going to start by, and has everybody, if you haven't put in your votes, I'm going to give you another 10, 15 seconds, and then we will put up the results. So we will see if this is going to be balanced or imbalanced. Our last vote was pretty close, and some of them have been very imbalanced. And then you guys get, since you're just joining us, David, after the debate, then everybody gets to vote again. Right, yes, yes. All right, here we are. Okay, so let me write this down. We have 57% in support that agree, and 43% that disagree. So fairly balanced, not too wide a gap there. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, David.
Thank you, Bonnie. I should begin by saying I wish I could have been here all day, but I've had other obligations throughout the day. I really would have liked to listen to the debates. I suspect that this topic is the elephant that's been in the room all day, so appropriate perhaps to get to it last but not least. And I just want to begin by really sincerely praising the ChinaPower project, which I think I'm really impressed with in various ways, and I've tried to be in the good counsel on the advisory council, but I use the web resources in my teaching, and I just think it's a tremendous initiative. And I'm sure it's been said many times already today by other speakers, but let me join them in congratulating you, Bonnie, and your team, and wish you good growth and further development. Okay, so I'm supposed to argue in favor of this proposition. I was a little reticent when invited to accept because of the wording of the proposition. The word benevolent, for example, jumped out at me, and I thought, that's immediately Daniel Bell's segue, benevolent. But anyway, after I started thinking about it, and Bonnie used her persuasive powers, I decided to accept, and I'm glad to do it because it's given me a chance to really think through, or try to think through, a bit more about these issues. So let me begin by giving you three numbers: 110, 12, and 9. You may wonder, what do these numbers have in common? Well, the first is the number of economies in the world that the World Bank says have become middle-income countries or middle-income economies, either upper middle income or lower middle income, but there is a categorization. Basically, the World Bank divides global economies into three categories: developing, middle income, and developed, okay? So since 1960, the World Bank tells us there have been 110 countries that have entered the middle income, newly industrialized economy, NIE strata. The second, 12, is a number of those which have successfully transitioned through this stage to become fully modern and developed economies. The rest, 98 of them, got stuck in this transitional stage, hence the term middle income trap, which you're familiar with. The third number, 9, is the number of those 12 successful countries that navigated their way through the middle income trap and stage to become fully developed modern economies. 9 of the 12 were either civilian authoritarian or military authoritarian regimes before coming out of the trap. Some of them were going into the trap, remained so during the trap, but every one of them, of those 9, democratized as it emerged from the trap. Now, what were those countries, you may wonder? Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Spain, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, and Turkey. The other 2, Italy and Greece, were already democratic before going into the trap. So those are the 12 countries in the world. And I remind you, this minority, really roughly 10%, not even 10%, of the countries go into middle-income traps emerge out of middle-income traps. So the norm is the middle-income trap. We should not assume that countries get out of them. Most do not. So in other words, there's a direct correlation between becoming a modern developed economy, based on the World Bank data anyway, and simultaneously becoming a more pluralized, liberalized, and democratic country, recognizing that democratic systems have their own characteristics and vary across countries. But there is a direct correlation, and maybe, in fact, I'm going to argue more than correlative. It's probably causal. No political liberalization, no economic modernization after, this is the crucial point, attaining newly industrialized economic status. Prior to that, certainly countries can transition from developing to newly industrialized status absent political liberalization. China has done so, very convincingly. China has proven that case. Indeed, I would agree that authoritarian political systems may in fact be advantageous and facilitative of economic development from the developing to the middle income levels. But that's where at least the data, and as I'll discuss in a minute, the literature, social science literature, is of agreement that you don't get to become a developed modern economy without political liberalization, full stop. I use the word liberalization, not democratization, but we can debate the definition of those terms. So again, just to remind you, the vast majority of countries do not successfully navigate this transition. They get stuck there indefinitely, which is precisely the danger for China, and in my view, precisely my prediction for China, getting stuck, joining the 98 other countries that never emerged. Why? Well, in short, there are 2 principal reasons. First, innovation. If you look at the successful 12, the one thing that they almost all had in common was that they innovated their way out of the middle income trap. They added real value to products and, more importantly, created new products and ways of doing things in order to gain economic efficiencies and economies of scale. Now, innovation is a big, complicated topic we can go into in the Q&A if you're interested. It's really the key variable, to my mind, for China's economic future. They know that. It's no secret. They're concentrating all kinds of resources around Shenzhen right now to create this innovation hub. Typical Chinese mercantilist, state-directed, investment. It's the way they go about doing things. So briefly, innovation is complicated, but in my mind, there are three dimensions to it, what I call top-down, bottom-up, and outside-in. So the top-down dimension of innovation, all modern economies and newly industrialized economies invest in. That's what states do. They invest in R&D. China's investment in R&D is today 2.3% of GDP. That's actually way below OECD levels. South Korea leads the world, 2.6, Taiwan, 2.5, Germany, I think 3.2, United States, 2.9, and so on. China's actually, in percentage terms, relatively low. But they're watering the plant. They're investing in 10 priority areas: robotics, a variety of healthcare industries, electric cars, biotech, nanotech, aerospace. I forget all 10, but they're very transparent about it. Say, we want to be global leaders by 2025. It's all part of the Made in China 2025 initiative. So they're watering the plant, they're investing considerably top down, and they're going to get return on investment and innovation in those 10 sectors. But innovation is really more a bottom-up process. It starts in educational institutions, it starts in society, there are cultural sources of innovation, political sources of innovation, political impediments to innovation, more importantly. And it's an outside, what I call outside-in phenomenon. Innovation is not something you do in a hothouse. You have to be connected 24/7 with all countries and professionals in your field around the world every day. Innovation is a collaborative exercise, in effect. So, in my view, China has the first, top-down, does not have the second and the third, bottom-up and outside-in. So those are two huge impediments to China successfully becoming an innovative society. And if you don't innovate, again, you don't get out of the middle-income trap. So, second reason is that the key issue for nations like China at this stage of development is not just the economic growth model. China's growth model we're all familiar with, fixed asset investment plus low-end manufacturing based on low-wage surplus labor. That's transitioning, or they're trying to transition, as we know, to service-based, consumer-based, and innovation-based economy. So this is exactly the proposition. Can they do it? There's probably no more studied issue in developmental economics and political science than the relationship between relationship between politics and economics. Politics is the independent variable here. Economics is the dependent variable at this stage of development. Marx could have told us that from all stages of development. Anyway, for economies to transition up the added value ladder, break through the developmental ceiling and make the kinds of qualitative transitions necessary to become truly modern, developed economies, political institutions must be facilitative. That's a term used by many political scientists, but I would note two in particular: James Robinson, Darren Acemoglu, authors of a really good book called Why Nations Fail. And they argue that if you're going to become a modern economy and move out of the middle income trap, and their book is based on a study of these 112 countries basically, they argue that these states need to stop being what they call extractive and rent-seeking states, which is precisely what the Chinese state has been for the last 30 years. And they must become what they call inclusive states. That requires tolerance and even facilitation of a wide variety of autonomous actors in society, including, importantly, the free flow of information. So this is directly related to the potential for innovation, right? So the first and the second elements, or reasons, I should say, interact here. Now, this line of argument is not new news to social scientists. So-called modernization theorists since the 1960s, and all of those we read in graduate school: Marty Lipset, Samuel Huntington, Walt Rostow, Ken Organsky, Alex Inclease, David Apter, and others, all identified this necessity. This is not a new, you could have put this slide up 35, 40 years ago. It was hotly debated then. And I think it needs, so if we're going to debate it now and consider it now, we need to go back and remind ourselves, refresh ourselves on that literature. They all argued, Huntington in particular, but they all argued that authoritarian regimes are ill-equipped to facilitate a post-extractive economy and meet the rising demands of a newly wealthy citizenry. That is the phase that Huntington characterized as the adaptation phase. He gets intellectual property rights on the term adaptation. It's the third phase of the development of those regimes: transformation, consolidation, adaptation. And he argued, and other modernization theorists, that these regimes either adapt politically, by which he meant becoming more inclusive, facilitative, and liberal, with a capital L, and become therefore more inclusive, hence increasing their chances of political survival, as well as facilitating the socioeconomic transformation out of the middle-income trap and providing greater public goods, or they fail to do so, stagnate, or in some cases, regress and die. So modernization theory, I think we should kind of refresh and remind ourselves about. Now, in addition to modernization theorists, there's another school of theory that is relevant to understanding this proposition in China today. That's what used to be known as comparative communist studies, and the development, or what I call the life cycle, of Leninist regimes. Okay, China is a Leninist-type regime. There are only four left on the planet, five, sorry: North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, and China. So if you study these Leninist regimes' life cycles, they follow a very predictable evolution through 6 stages. I don't know if I have time to run through my 6 stages. Where's my watch? But China is following the predicted life cycle that all these other regimes followed almost precisely. First stage is, of course, revolution and seizure of power, followed by consolidation of state power and extension of power over all aspects of society. That's what we saw in China in the 50s. Then the mobilization of society, which basically we saw from the Great Leap through the 1960s, then to the extraction of resources and capital from society for state purposes, which is what we've seen essentially since the late 70s, to finally, or not finally, to the 5th stage of bureaucratization and Brezhnevization of state power. You remember this phase from the Soviet Union. It was the penultimate phase. The last phase of the Leninist life cycle is a kind of corrective phase of adaptation, where these Leninist regimes see the handwriting on the wall, and they realize you either have to liberalize to extend your life or not. So Gorbachev tried that. He tried it too late. By that point in time, the system was too broken, too fragile, and just shattered. The Chinese are precisely at that stage now, and have been, I would argue, for the last 15 years. So I think both modernization theorists and comparative communist theorists have something to offer us in thinking about China today and in its future. And we have to use these two kind of prisms, the Leninist political prism and the middle-income trap economic prism, to understand the stage where China is today, and they are directly related to each other. So this is China's current dilemma, and I think it's a really profound one. Quite simply, the country is not moving ahead politically, and therefore not moving ahead economically either. China can stay on its current road, the road to continued relative economic stagnation. I emphasize the word relative there because any $10 trillion economy growing at 6%, it's hard to call that stagnation. But relative to what it could do if it makes the economic reforms that they aspire to. Anyway, they stay on this path: relative economic stagnation, increased social tensions, and political decline, protracted political decline over time, leading perhaps, and I emphasize the word perhaps, the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party and regime over time. Don't ask me when, but I would measure it in years or decades. The question is, when did the atrophy start? I would argue it started in the early 90s, so we're already 20 plus years into this Leninist decline, if you look at it that way. So, nor can the many social tensions in China be effectively managed without a political loosening. And that's the second part of the proposition. China today is, in my view, seething with growing repression, inequalities, frustrations, pent-up anger, ethnic unrest, 180,000 demonstrations every year, and other forms of potential and extant social instability. This is not a future state. This is an existing state. So continually cracking down and repressing, which is what the regime has been doing since 2009, is not an effective long-term solution for managing social tensions and social groups who should be given a greater role, more inclusive role in society and economic development. So let me just wrap up here. The CCP is acting in a profoundly insecure manner. Repression and control is not a sign of security and confidence, just the opposite. Such regime behavior is holding China back, not pushing it forward, and is a surefire guarantee for getting stuck in the middle income trap and protracted regime decline. So let me conclude by observing that China need not democratize to get out of these traps. It can return to what I call soft authoritarianism, which it abandoned in 2009. As the experience of the 12 successful NIEs show, they all passed through a soft authoritarian transitional phase en route to democratization. So we have to think of this as an evolutionary process. It doesn't go straight from authoritarianism to democracy. It's a transitional evolutionary process. So China was doing this, I would argue, in the 1980s under Zhao Ziyang. It was doing this from 96 to 08 under Jiang Zemin in the first term of Hu Jintao. But since 2009 has abandoned it and is acting in extremely insecure and repressive ways, as I say, out of self-preservation. They think that's self-preservation. So there are two general scenarios, just to conclude. I know I've said that already, but two general scenarios for the proposition. China can either return to, and I emphasize return to, it's something they were doing. It's not that they have to start something new. They can go back to what they were doing up until 2009, of managed political reform and liberalization from above. That's what Deng Qinghong was trying to do. He understood the Soviet collapse very well. That will produce economic and social reform, better chances of getting through and out of the middle income trap and transition to a mature economy, or they can keep doing what they're doing today, which is, to my mind, a recipe for economic stagnation, aggravated social problems, and protracted political decline. So the ultimate question, does the CCP regime have the confidence to open up politically in order to succeed economically and socially? I wish I could be optimistic on that point, but the evidence at the moment does not suggest that. Thank you.
Okay, we'll now turn to Professor Daniel Bell to argue against the proposition.
So thank you, Bonnie, for the invite, and thank you. This has been a fascinating day, and thank you also for giving me the right to vote, because I confess it's something I haven't done for 3 decades. I'm from Canada, and Canadians don't have the right to vote when they're abroad. I've been abroad for 30 years, so it's really empowering, I find. But perhaps almost dangerously so, because I find I'm voting on issues that I don't have very good understanding about, about China's trade links with Central Asia and so on. Luckily, my vote doesn't have any consequence. Anyway, of course, there are tons of problems in China. We all know that, poverty, gaps between rich and poor, environmental problems, repression, and so on. But the question is, what kind of reform is needed? Is it gradual reform, or is it radical political reform? And I'm going to take radical political reform, meaning the end of one-party rule, or the collapse of the Communist Party, as a long-term thing. I'm going to argue against that. I'm going to say, of course, there's a need for reform, much more opening up in different ways, but it should be on the foundation of the standard that has been motivating political reform over the past 3 decades. And what is that standard? Well, in my book, The China Model, I use somewhat awkward terminology. I call it vertical democratic meritocracy. This is the idea that there's democracy at local levels, including elections, but when it comes to selection and promotion of leaders, the further up you move the chain of political command, the more there are meritocratic mechanisms, such as examinations and performance evaluations at lower levels of government, that affect the prospects of public officials. That's the model that I think has been, it's highly imperfect, but that's the standard that has been motivating political reform over the past 3 decades or so. And it has obvious advantages, right? One is that all the leaders at the city level and above have substantial political experience, right? Nobody anyway, I won't mention any names. The leaders can have a long-term view. They are not so bound by short-term electoral cycles. They could consider the interests of future generations, people who wouldn't have a vote if it was a kind of democratic elections. They could focus on policy issues. They don't have to waste time giving the same campaign speech over and over again and raising funds. Obviously, there are also disadvantages, and some of them, like how to limit their power, how to have more accountability, how to prevent the ossification of hierarchies, how to have different mechanisms of legitimacy. I think you can address all those without moving towards one person, one vote at the highest levels of government, which would really wreck the advantages of political meritocracy. So I'm going to go through each of these 3 issues. We have stable society, we have modern economy, and we have benevolent political system. On all 3 of those, I'm going to argue that having a gradual political reform is more desirable than having a radical political reform, which really means moving towards, let's just call it free and fair competitive elections to choose leaders at the highest levels of government. So what about, let me begin with the easiest one, I think, which is stable society. Obviously, in a huge country, it's better to have some sort of meritocratic systems to select top leaders. If they make mistakes, political experience matters more in big countries than in small countries. And if they make mistakes, it's hugely serious. You want them to have informed political judgment and a proven record of so. Political meritocracy has a long history in China. Ever since the age of Confucius, most Chinese political thinkers have been arguing over what is the best way of selecting leaders with superior ability and virtue. What are the best modes of assessment of abilities and virtues, and so on. Is it examinations? Is it performance evaluations? Is it other things? That has been the main standard, and I've been teaching at Tsinghua University for 13 years. That's what my colleagues argue about. As mentioned, this political meritocracy has been reestablished over the past 3 decades, in form, not in content, right? Over most of imperial Chinese history, how were public officials chosen? First by examinations, then by performance evaluations at lower levels of government. That system has been restored in form, more or less, over the past 3 decades. And finally, it's supported by the people, according to public survey, political survey data, by, for example, my former colleague, Shi Tianjian, who unfortunately passed away. His recently published book shows that there's strong support for what he calls guardianship discourse in China. Another reason, too, is that it's very important in an age when there's constant innovation to have high-quality leaders who could respond to shocks, like environmental shocks and financial shocks, and have long-term perspectives. So, of course, there's also a need for gradual reform on issues like corruption, which in a system where meritocracy is a legitimizing principle, corruption means that the leaders at basic are not virtuous, right? The bottom line of virtue is that you shouldn't be corrupt. So if you don't address corruption, it means it's a stake in the heart of the system, and you have to address corruption. I think you also need more freedom of speech, more freedom of association, and so on. You can have all that without moving towards one person, one vote to select top leaders. That's what I mean by gradual reform. What would radical reform mean? Well, again, it means moving towards, let's say, like a Taiwan-style system where you have one person, one vote to select top leaders. Well, what would it mean? I think the best case scenario in terms of stability would be something like in Taiwan, where you have some sort of political paralysis. The government isn't really concerned with future generations or with the rest of the world, and there's quite poisonous social relations, at least among the political elites. The worst case scenarios are far more disturbing. You would have communist populists appealing to people's worst emotions. We're familiar with that here, right? There could be 2 of them competing, or even with a capitalist populist, and you could have civil war. You could have independence movements. You could have more foreign influence in China. All these things that are clearly grounded in China's 20th century experience that are very real possibilities. So obviously, some sort of gradual political reform is better to maintain a stable society. What about modern economy? Well, look, China, remember, think of it as a continent, right? Parts of China are already quite modern, right? Hangzhou and, for example. I mean, it's really a question of, how to extend this prosperity to the rest of the country. And of course, I agree that there's a need for reform of SOEs and more market reforms and so on, and also innovation. There's a lot of innovation in China. You know, there's 1 million patents have been issued over the past year. And in the internet and sharing economy, there's tremendous amount of boom in China. But I want to really focus on this issue. Innovation per se isn't really the key. What really matters is sustainable innovation, right? You want innovation that doesn't threaten issues like environmental issues or climate change. Which kind of, or even issues like, you know, you want, you know, what in 30 years' time, 50 years' time, I spent a semester in Stanford. What do people argue about? What's the next war? It's not with China. It's with artificial intelligence. You want a government that's going to regulate artificial intelligence and also think about issues like climate change. Do you think if China moved towards one person, one vote to select top leaders, that it would be better in this than the current system? I mean, the best case scenario is that you would have moving. It's very hard to govern a big country. Sorry, democracy works much better in small places like Denmark, you know, than in huge countries. And so you would maybe something moving towards like, you know, more money would have influence in the political system. The government wouldn't be able to crack down on vested interests as much. You'd have growing income inequality. That's like the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that, again, you'd have communist populists saying, let's expropriate the rich, you know, forget about climate change. Let's focus on immediate issues, and no attempt to regulate things like AI. You would have, again, it would be serious disaster. Why take the risk? Why even argue? Why even think that that's a good thing to do, you know? Finally, benevolent rule, and I agree, I like that because it does have Confucian echoes. But, you know, what does benevolence mean? Well, you know, when we think of the term used in Confucianism, for example, that's a common translation for the term zhen, you know, which really means, and what is the opposite of benevolent rule? It's really war, right? When Mencius you know, the book of Mencius opens with Mencius severely criticizing this king for launching unjust and immoral wars. That's the opposite of benevolence. Look, what has China done since 1979, since it's reestablished this political meritocracy? It's lifted 500 million people out of poverty, hasn't gone to war once, okay? So is that not benevolent? No, not, of course, never mind unjust war. You know, I don't want to talk about other countries, but, you know, no war since 1979. Is that not an impressive record so far? So, of course, I agree that you need more freedom and openness in the future. But do you think that moving towards one person, one vote to select top leaders is going to reduce the possibility of war and promote benevolence? You know, what's likely to be the best case scenario? Think about it, you know? And the best case scenario is that you would have, I mean, perhaps like less funds to support peacekeeping abroad, which China now is the major funder for. You'd have maybe more short-term minded thinking. But the worst case scenario, again, these communist populists could say, let's have war with Japan and appeal to people's worst emotions. Think about it. We can criticize China now, but they tamper down. You know, much of the censorship is directed not at liberal views, but at extreme nationalist views. You know, again, I'm not defending that, but it's worth keeping in mind, you know, that these are the sorts of views. You have a lot of deplorable people, you know, in all countries, actually. That's one universal kind of truth. And they would be given, you know, more, they would have more say, unfortunately. Finally, I just want to make one point, you know, that I like this term of peaceful competition, which was mentioned earlier today. You know, why not have different political systems? You have flawed democracies and flawed meritocracies competing to do good things, serving the people, dealing with climate change, with the threats of artificial intelligence and so on. Isn't it good to have different forms of the diversity of political systems competing to do good things? Isn't that better than assuming that we're all converging towards this? First we have hard authoritarianism, then soft authoritarianism, and then liberal democracy. Well, that to me is like, it's not a desirable outcome, sorry to say. You know, I think that China has already a good standard, grounded in its own history, which has inspired political reform over the last 30 years, still deeply flawed system, but it can and should serve as the basis for gradual political reform in the future. Thank you.
Well, this has really been excellent. I think we really have two stark perspectives here. And I will give you the opportunity, if you want to sort of incorporate some rebuttal, but let me collect a couple of questions, and then you can include your rebuttal remarks when we respond. We do have a very hard end time at 4:15 because Senator Sullivan will be arriving. So let's take those two there, and then we'll take one back there.
David Kornbluth, formerly of the Foreign Service. This is a question for Professor Shambaugh. Bruce Davidson and others, based on survey research, have concluded that the Communist Party is pretty popular in China and that the Chinese are generally satisfied with the way they're governed. Where would you see the impulse coming from for radical political change?
Here you go. Yeah, that's okay. Just use mine.
Larry Meinert with the USGS. I was fascinated by your historical analysis of the decline or the life cycle of communist societies, and particularly the parallel between China and Russia. So here's a radical question for you. If the decline of Russia can in some way be linked to President Reagan's instigation or overseeing that change, not that he caused it, is there a possibility of President-elect Trump doing the same thing for China?
All right. We have two in the back corner over there, and then we'll come back to the front to Gil Rosman, then we'll come back to the panel.
Bill Jones from EIR. When I was listening to David, he talked about going back to the 1960s, looking at Seymour Lipton. I got the feeling in listening to your talk that I was in the 1960s, listening to a criticism that would have been issued at that time. But things have changed a lot. But the thing I want to mention is the issue of mercantilism, which you mentioned. Now, most of the countries of the world, including these United States, developed on the basis of a mercantilist policy. Alexander Hamilton was not a radical free trader, as everybody knows or should know. I don't know if they showed it at the in New York when they went through the to the Broadway show. But if you look at his writings, that was the case. Japan followed that model, right? Korea followed that model. Bismarck, Germany became an industrial power after his meeting with, President Grant and people like Kelly, Pig Iron Kelly, and adopted that model. So it's not something that you can just disregard, because it has been a very powerful model. You also indicate that there's this transition from that mercantilism or from a dirigist model into this liberal economy, which is like paradise. But if you look around at the world today, let's take a look at some of these liberal economies. Let's look at Portugal. Let's look at Spain. It doesn't look so good, so that people aren't really attracted to that model on the basis of its own merits. And it seems to me that if China is in a different situation now, there will be changes, but it won't be necessarily what Gorbachev tried to do, because that is an awful model that they're always looking at, the Chinese are always looking at, and they want to avoid. I think it will change, but any radical shift, and I agree with Professor Bell here, that any radical shift on this basis, by trying to get rid of the Communist Party or making it into a multi-party democracy in the short term, will lead to a collapse of China. And that would be devastating for the entire world for obvious reasons.
Okay, behind you, the gentleman sitting in the back. Please make it concise.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Jing from Georgetown University. Just a quick question about the anti-corruption campaign since 2012. There are much more officials who were investigated than before, and many people, but some scholars believe that this campaign is nothing more than a political purge against the opponents, especially those who are against the political reform we are talking about here. So, what do you think of the influence of this campaign on the political reform in the future in China? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And last question, Gil Rosman in the front over here.
Gil Rosman, the Asan Forum. This is a remarkable panel given the DC environment. I have rarely heard three comparative theoretical perspectives presented as the foundation for policy analysis. So we've got comparative modernization, comparative communism or socialism, and comparative Confucianism. And yet, it seems that sometimes using them ends up with a sort of straw man. So we got comparative Confucianism sort of versus one man, one vote, when that wasn't really the perspective. And I like the idea that, the possibility of some soft authoritarianism as transitional, that maybe I call that reform socialism revived. So, and David, your earlier work stressed sort of what the Chinese had learned from the Soviet example. Now it sounds like you're saying they failed to learn properly from the Soviet example. They haven't picked up the lesson of comparative communism well. Maybe the stage of modernization, they don't understand the transitional aspects, which many of the initial theorists didn't get right either. One of you comment on that.
Okay, terrific set of questions. So David, why don't we start with you? Got about 5-7 minutes. Can you cover it in that?
I'll do my best.
I know you have a lot. He's got a lot of notes.
Gosh, maybe I'll start with Gil, who himself has been a major contributor to all three of these bodies of theory that you just noted: modernization theory, Leninist theory, and Confucianism. Your career and your many publications have educated me, and I know many other people in all three. So you're quite right to point out, and many people may be wondering, Shambaugh, you sure have changed your tune. You used to write about adaptation. Now you're writing about atrophy. And the reason is because the object of study has changed. China changed. I can tell you precisely when it changed. September of 2009. September 17th, if you want a date. That's when the fourth plenum of the 16th Congress adjourned, released a very radical, actually, use that term, communique calling for managed political reform from above in many different areas. It was the capstone document on what they had been doing for the previous decade under Zheng Qinghong's aegis. He's the key man, in my view. Many people don't give Zheng Qinghong credit. He did other things too. Jiang Zemin's hatchet man, he's an ultimate insider. He was a lot of things, but he was a serious political reformer, in my view. And so he had to retire for age reasons the next spring, and a series of events took place over the next 18 months that shifted the regime's emphasis from soft authoritarianism to hard authoritarianism. Now, how does that relate to the not learning the Soviet example? That's a huge subject that you've written about, I've written about, but it's absolutely central to understanding where the CCP is today. There were two schools of thought in the CCP who had studied the Soviet collapse and other communist systems, not just GDR and others. And the first school was, you have to manage change incrementally from above. That's the Zheng Qinghong school. He argued Gorbachev was not wrong in what he was trying to do. He was too late in doing what he tried to do. The system was too brittle, too fragile, and it couldn't take the shock therapy. So that school of thought said, if Khrushchev hadn't been overthrown, you've written about all this, and the Soviet Union had 25 years of Khrushchev-like political reform, it may still be here. So he argued that we have to manage political opening and change from above. Then there was a second school of thought, says you cannot manage opening and political change from above. It will cascade out of your control and you will be overthrown and fall from power. That was the second school. Xi Jinping adheres to that school of thought. And many others, Zhou Yongkang, who was not unimportant in 2009, and other bureaucratic interests I could go into, propaganda system and so on. Anyway, 2009 was a critical year, a pivot year, from soft to hard authoritarianism. So my whole argument today, and in this book of mine, is that they could pivot back. This is a cyclical thing, and if you go back to Deng Xiaoping in the late 80s, China's gone through cycles. They call it the Fang Shou Zhou Qi, Fang for opening, Shou for closing, cycle. It's Zhou Qi. They've been through 7 Fang Shou Zhou Qis since 1985. So right now they're in a rather prolonged Shou Zhou Qi, right, of closing. They could go back. I hope they go back. As I've been arguing, they would be much better advised to go back. But the longer they wait, the more brittle their system becomes, and the harder it's going to be, should they decide to go back, to institute those kinds of Zheng Qinghong type reforms. So we have the second Soviet school arguing hunker down, repress, stay in power, snuff out any forms of dissent, give no civil society, no space, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we've been witnessing since 2009. So Dixon, you ask about. He's my cherished colleague at GW, but we do our research on China and in China in different ways. Frankly, I don't think social surveys matter a great deal in a society like China. What they tell you is a data point. And if the Chinese people are happy with the Chinese Communist regime, if that's what the surveys of Dixon and Tang Wenfang and others tell us, then that's a data point. I'm not rejecting that. I'm just saying that it has to be taken together with other forms of analysis. I do bureaucratic analysis. I study the Chinese Communist state, as you've heard, kind of bureaucratically. I don't think popular perceptions of legitimacy of the state matter very much. Okay? So it's just a different way of doing research. I wouldn't say Bruce is wrong, it's just different. You ask, 1 minute, where would political reform come from? Well, in systems like this, in those 9 countries and in other former communist systems, it comes from within the system. 提制内 in Chinese, it's 提制内, it's inside the system. It's not, Filipino, popular, people democracy. It's usually inner system, middle class, educated classes, and civil society that collectively push for political reform. That's where I would see it coming from. And you ask, what is Xi Jinping cracking down on? Precisely those 5 sectors. And why? Because he gets it. So that's all I really, and then finally the analogy of Bill Jones, I agree with you on mercantilism, so I'll just say that at that stage of development. But the question about, are we in a period today with China, will Trump be like Reagan, presiding over the decline of the Soviet Union, if I understood the question correctly? Is there a parallel there? I think the answer is perhaps. Because if you accept my argument about the state of the Chinese communist system, qua system, if it is in decline, if they are acting in the insecure way that I argue they are, then we are witnessing perhaps the moribund final stage. How long that stage lasts, I don't know. If that is the case, that has policy implications for the United States. Do we get close to a regime that is in its decline? Of course, they would argue we're in our decline too. If they look at our system after the last year, I wouldn't get too close to us either. Okay, so I think it deserves some comparative thinking, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, Daniel, 5-6 minutes, and then we're going to vote.
Okay, I don't think I'll need 5 or 6 minutes, but I think there are limits to comparative thinking. I mean, it's very useful, but there are also limits. I mean, for example, the language of Leninism, saying that China and North Korea are in the same camp because they have Leninist structures. I mean, I just think that the differences between China and North Korea are really totally different, not just political systems, but different like moral universes, and the key difference really is that China has implemented this very rigorous, imperfect system of meritocracy to select and promote leaders. There's nothing like that in North Korea. It's grounded in a pre-communist history. I think that Confucian and other moral traditions and political traditions in Chinese history, including the legalist tradition, help us to understand what's going on much more than using the language of Leninism or communism. I mean, even the Communist Party, we hear the word communist, but remember, it's a hugely internally diverse organization. Capitalists can be members of it now, and ever since, Jiang Zemin. So even the language of communism is somewhat misleading to try to account of the political system in China. Now, what about the anti-corruption thing? And I think that there has been a major change since the Xi Jinping government, and I think the major change to me is really this heavy focus on corruption. And to understand that, we really have to understand this meritocracy as a source of legitimacy, because in a democracy, corruption is not a fatal flaw, right? You can vote the leaders out of power. But in a system that has meritocracy as a legitimizing principle, if the leaders are corrupt, it means that they're not meritorious and that the whole political system has a deep problem. So it's an existential problem. And if you don't deal with corruption, this whole system is at risk of collapse. I think the leaders realize that, and and again, political surveys show that. I do think political surveys do matter, and corruption was viewed as a huge problem according to political surveys. And there's been this focus on corruption over the past 2 or 3 years, which has been systematic. Still a long way to go in terms of being effective. It's true that Confucianism matters a lot, but so does legalism. And when it comes to dealing with problems in a short term, arguably the legalist tradition, which relies more on harsh punishment and fear, is more effective. And in the long term, you need much more structural changes, including now they're doing pilot pilot programs with supervisory commissions in different provinces and so on. And more, that's, of course, increased salaries and more transformation of education and so on is all important to have long-term changes. But that's really to understand the current focus. What's the link with repression? Well, I do think there is, and I do think that they're much more paranoid than they used to be, and I wish that it wasn't that way. Maybe it's viewed that, because the anti-corruption campaign, what's different from before is that before it was really going after enemies. Now it's creating enemies, right? More so than before. There's so many enemies now against the leaders. That makes sense. That's the real source of paranoia now. It's really linked to this anti-corruption campaign, which you have to understand to place it in this meritocratic context, what's going on. If the anti-corruption campaign is successful, which I hope and I think it will be eventually, it'll take a long time, then we would expect, I think, a loosening up of the repression. I think there are also many counter trends in China, right? Schwarzman College is one of them, where it's a much more open educational setting compared to the rest of China. I mean, I could go into more detail if you're interested. And even on issues like, there's much more open transmission now of pollution. Yes, we have to thank the American Embassy for publicizing that, but finally the government learned from that, and now there's much more open information. So I mean, there are these counter trends as well. We shouldn't be, I think, too pessimistic. And I do think we need to leave aside our kind of standards that we learn as children in the West, for judging what counts as political progress and regress in China. It took me a while, it's a bit of a shock to the moral system, but I do think it's important to go through that, really.
But I'm glad you enjoy your opportunity to vote here today. And with that, we will segue to our final vote, where we are going to ask you all to once again vote on the proposition that China must undertake radical political reforms in order to successfully transition into a modern economy with a stable society and benevolent political system. So we'll give you all another 10, 15 seconds. Please all register your votes. I'll remind you that in our initial vote, it was 57% in agreement with the proposition and 43% in disagreement. So we will see how much change there has been after our really terrific debate. Okay, let's go ahead and put up the results. Oh, this is the first time all day that we have had a flip. And we now have 55% disagree and 45% agreement. That's fascinating. This is the only debate we have had today where we have had a narrowing of the gap. This is the first one that we have had, which would be a total flip. So which we had an opportunity to talk about why, but I'm afraid that we have run out of time. This is really...
I like voting, thank you.
All right. We now have a more avid supporter here of voting, and one man, one vote, or one person, one vote. But it's really been a terrific series of debates today. And we are now going to move in just a couple of minutes to have our keynote speaker, who will be Senator Sullivan, who's going to be addressing issues relating to China and U.S. policy going forward. So I know you're all going to look forward to that. And I would say, before I ask you to join me in thanking our panelists, that if anybody is sitting over in the back and you would like to sit closer here to listen to the senator, these two tables, we've had a lot of people leave, and I'd be just as happy to fill them up if people would like to come a little bit closer. So please join me in thanking Daniel Bell and David Shambaugh.
Thank you. Thank you.